In orchids, another thing, it only takes one visit to move all the pollen to another flower because the pollen comes off as one mass in orchids. But yeah, so the bee gets really nothing out of this at all. In fact, you could argue that it's selectively disadvantageous because it's wasting a lot of energy in an attempt to reproduce here. And at most, it's just getting a cheap thrill that doesn't even really come to culmination. It's really not very effective. It's not benefiting the bee in any way. All right, so moth pollination is another great type of pollination that's seen really widely and has evolved multiple times. I just mentioned the Madagascar star orchid, but it's evolved in a lot of different plant groups, not just orchids, a lot of different flowering plants. And here you can see a hawk moth with its tongue down in a flower. This is moths that pollinate tend to be active around dusk, these hawk moths, and they have a great sense of smell as well as sight. The flowers of these plants that are hawk moth pollinated are typically really brightly colored and stand out in the darkness. They also produce sweet, fruity odors. Think of jasmine. Jasmine is a really common type of, that jasmine odor is really common in a lot of these moth-pollinated flowers. And they're only producing those odors in the evening when the moths are likely to be active. And those odors are really heavy, and they carry in the air pretty great distances. So the odors can help to get the moth in the vicinity of the flowers where they finally see them. And then these flowers will tend to have pretty long nectar tubes. They're really narrow and delicate, and they don't produce very much nectar. Moths don't have really high nutrient requirements. And you can see there's no landing platform there. The moths hover while they're pollinating. So this is unlike a bee flower. You saw the bee had landed. Bee flowers often have a platform for the bee to land. That's not true of moth-pollinated flowers. All right, butterflies are another type of hymenopteran, or another type of lepidopteran, that are really important for pollination and angiosperms, but they have a slightly different syndrome. Butterflies have to land when they feed, and so the inflorescence usually is flat-topped, or an individual flower will be have a nice landing platform for them, and they're often really brightly colorful. Butterflies are active in the daytime, so these are generally, well, they can be white flowered, but they can be a lot of different flower colors, as you can see in these particular photos. And they also produce often a sweet scent that will attract butterflies that also have good olfactory senses as well, and detect odors well. But butterflies are not intelligent pollinators. They're sort of at the opposite end of the spectrum from bees. And studies of butterfly cognition have shown that butterflies can only really learn one thing at a time, and that new learned thought will displace the previous learned thought. So they can only really hang on to one learned thought at a time, and then if you scare them, they forget everything. So they're not very effective at pollination that involves a lot of learning. So butterflies are beautiful, but not particularly sharp. Birds, though, of course, are really intelligent, and there are some birds that are really effective pollinators. Hummingbirds in the Western Hemisphere here are really our pollinator birds here. If you go to the Eastern Hemisphere, there aren't any hummingbirds. Hummingbirds are endemic to North and South America. And in other parts of the world, the birds that pollinate actually have to land when they feed, whereas if you watch hummingbirds feed, they hover while they feed on nectar from flowers. So in the Western Hemisphere here, the bird-pollinated flowers do not have a landing platform, but they do have some kind of landing perch in the Eastern Hemisphere. At least some part of the inflorescence allows the birds to land while they feed. But birds in general, of course, have really high nutritive requirements. Hummingbirds have metabolisms that are kind of off the scale. So these bird-pollinated flowers have to produce a lot of nectar. And they have colors that are often fall in that red-orange part of the spectrum that bees don't see, or that see as black. And this specialization towards wavelengths that the birds can see and bees can't see may help to militate against nectar thievery, because these flowers also produce a lot of nectar as required, as I mentioned, for an animal that has high nutrient requirements. And so they often have a long tube. These birds have long beaks. These tubes are really tough and durable. They're not delicate like the tubes of moth-pollinated flowers. They have to be able to withstand this probing by a hard bill. But bees can still drill a hole through the tube down at the base and rob the nectar and not pollinate the flower in the process. So if the color is reddish or orange, that's going to help at least to keep bees away. They're not going to see it as easily. So there's probably been selection for colors that don't overlap with the bee end of the spectrum. Birds are also, at least pollinating birds, have really bad olfactory senses. They don't have the ability to pick up on odors. And so if you see a bird-pollinated flower and smell it, you're not going to pick up any scent. There's no point in producing a scent, which can be expensive, and it's not going to help in terms of attracting birds, which are relying on visual senses alone. And sometimes those visual senses can confuse hummingbirds, even though they are intelligent. Here you can see a hummingbird on a clothesline, and they are definitely attracted to red colors. And if you've worn a red hat in an area where there are a lot of hummingbirds, you've probably been buzzed by them in the past. All right, bat pollination is something we don't think about much around here, but in the tropics, and even in our southwestern deserts where we have some big cacti like the saguaro, it can be really important. And of course, like moths, hawk moths, bats are active in the dusk or evening, and so these flowers, like in the case of moth flowers, have to be brightly colored, and they also produce fruity odors or musky odors in the case of bats a lot of times that allow bats to hone in on them before they see them. And unlike moth flowers, these are typically robust flowers that have to be able to withstand a lot of rough treatment. They produce a lot of nectar. Bats have a high energy requirement. They also produce quite a bit of pollen, which bats also can go for. And the bats might hover or they might land to feed on these particular types of flowers. All right, fly pollination, as I mentioned, we're pretty fortunate that flies are not the main pollinators of flowering plants, or else the world would be a very stinky and unpleasant place during the flowering season at least. But there are a number of flowering plants that have specialized to attract flies. And these plants are good examples of deceit pollination, like the orchids that attract the male bees that I mentioned earlier. And the typical syndrome of fly pollination is to have a flower that has sort of a reddish-orange coloration and has white spots all over it. And that would then mimic raw meat with maggots crawling through it, the white spots. And the reason the flies visit is because they detect that visual signal, but they also, more importantly, pick up on the smell of rotting flesh, which these plants produce, chemicals very similar to that of cadavers. And the pollinators then go and land on these flowers, lay their eggs, and in the process they pick up pollen or deliver pollen. But their larvae, upon hatching, starve to death. There's no food here for the larvae. So this is definitely, I mean, we can argue about whether the male bees that visit the bee orchids are really getting ripped off that much in terms of selective disadvantage to them. But in the case of flies, they're definitely suffering a fitness decrease by laying eggs. They're not going to survive, or the larvae are not going to survive. That sort of thing wouldn't work out very well unless flies were very common and can withstand a lot of reproductive failure. But fortunately for these plants, flies are everywhere and pretty abundant, and some mortality of progeny of flies does not lead to the breakdown of this system. All right, and as I mentioned, the largest unbranched inflorescence in the world is a fly-pollinated plant, the Titanarum. And I didn't mention that the largest flower in the world is the Rafflesia, shown here on the right, which weighs in at about 22 pounds. It's this huge flower produced by a parasitic flowering plant, but all of its foliage is actually inside of other plants. It's complete endoparasite of other flowering plants. Both of these species grow in Indonesia. They're very distantly related. They're independent origins of fly pollination. But this monster flower on the right is just one of many members of this genus Rafflesia that rely on this type of deceit pollination, and it happens to be the largest in the world as far as flowers go. All right, so wind pollination is really important for a lot of hardwood trees, flowering plant trees, and quite a few groups of plants, and it's evolved multiple times from animal pollination, as I mentioned. And it leads to a whole suite of characteristics shared by different wind-pollinated plants that have evolved wind pollination independently. So there's a number of features that really favor wind pollination and have evolved convergently in different groups. Of course, one thing that you can imagine is that there's no need for an attractant or a reward because we're not dealing with animals here. We're dealing with physical forces, and we don't need to attract them or reward them. So they're basically, a lot of times we lose the petals, and even the sepals sometimes in these flowers. They tend to have either pistillate or staminate expression in an individual flower, but not both. So these are plants that have to produce a large amount of pollen. They don't have the kind of precision and accuracy of animal pollinated plants. And there's a high potential for selfing as a result. So these tend to have unisexual flowers. As I mentioned, petals small or absent. That's also the fact that the petals are small or absent isn't just that petals are expensive to produce and there's no need to produce them if you're not attracting a pollinator. Petals can also get in the way. If you're relying on wind for pollination, you want to get all these inert surfaces out of the way, like petals. So these things also tend to flower when before they leaf out in the springtime if they're deciduous. And these often are deciduous plants that drop their leaves during one part of the year. And they tend to flower before they leaf out again. So we don't have leaves or petals getting in the way of pollen moving to stigmatic surfaces. The anthers are only opening in dry weather, which makes a lot of sense because under dry conditions, pollen can move more freely through the air. And they have typically an enlarged surface area of the stigmatic region, which maximizes the potential for pollen capture. Also, people study the aerodynamics of pollen in these wind-pollinated plants in wind tunnel experiments and have shown that oftentimes the architecture of the plant overall will tend to result in more pollen capture than would occur otherwise. So there are some features of the architecture of the flowers or the inflorescence that will tend to result in more pollen capture than you might expect. And the pollen, shown here on the lower right, has a dry outer surface that's smooth, unlike the sculptured, oily pollen surface we get in biotically pollinated plants. All right, now water pollination is very unusual, but there are a lot of aquatic flowering plants. These are secondarily aquatic flowering plants. Flowering plants have moved back into aquatic environments from terrestrial environments on several different occasions. And when they do that, there's a bit of a challenge when it comes to pollination because pollen is commonly destroyed when it comes into contact with water. And so flowering plants have come up with ways of pollinating in an aquatic environment that don't usually result in the pollen staying dry. And this is a great case in ribbon grass here, where you can see on the far right a staminate flower. So it actually detaches its staminate flowers from the rest of the plant before they open. They go to the surface, they're buoyant, they open up, they expose their pollen to the air, and they float around like little boats on the surface, whereas the pistillate flowers are still attached to the plant, and they're held up near the surface, but slightly under tension. The surface where the stigma is exposed is slightly depressed, so there's a meniscus there. The water level is slightly depressed. The flower is held just slightly with some tension at the surface, and then these little boats of staminate flowers slide down into that trough, and the anthers come into contact with the stigmatic surface. So that's a really interesting type of way of preventing wetting of the pollen that results in pollination in this group. Now there are some flowering plants that do have pollen that can resist water immersion, and the marine grasses, which are not true grasses, but the eelgrass that we get off the marine in the intertidal zone and in sloughs here in California, which is a flowering plant that lives in the open ocean, it has thread-like pollen that actually is released underwater, and it wraps around the stigmatic surfaces of the pistillate flowers before it germinates. So there's some variation in water pollination for sure. All right, so there are a number of trends in floral evolution that are the result, in many cases, of coevolution with pollinators, animal pollinators, or with abiotic pollinators like wind or water pollinating agents. One that we talked about already is the loss of either staminate function or pistillate function. So primitively in flowering plants, or I should say sort of in the stereotypic flowering plant that we showed, there are 4 different whorls of flower parts. There are sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels. But some flowering plants have lost one or more of those whorls. They've either lost some of the sterile whorls, like the petals in some wind-pollinated plants, or they've lost pistillate function, or they've lost staminate function. We've already talked about that. This is an example in red maple where we have just staminate function in those particular flowers. But one thing we didn't talk about is fusion of parts. So one thing we see is that sometimes the parts of one type, like all the petals, will fuse together, or unlike parts, such as the stamens and the petals, will fuse together. And the foxglove shown up here at the right is a great example where both of those things have occurred. The petals, you can see, have fused together into a sympedalous corolla, and the stamens are fused to the inside of the petals. And that type of fusion results in higher precision and accuracy of pollen placement on the pollinator. So we see that sort of thing happening frequently. It will tend to ensure that pollination is accurate and precise, requires less pollen to be produced by the plant. There's less gametic wastage, less pollen wastage. Another thing that can happen is that we have the evolution of bilateral symmetry, where there's only one way that you could cut this flower in half and get 2 equal halves, just like in our bodies. And this will tend to this tends to be associated with fusion as well, and it especially tends to be associated with specialization with other pollinators, particular pollinators, and increased speciation rates following along with that specialization. And finally, another trend we see is protection of the ovary of the flower, which contains the ovules, of course, the immature seeds, which are very precious. And this protection of the ovary can occur by fusion of other floral parts around the ovary. So we can have the floral tube formed by the base of the stamens, sepals, and petals fusing around the ovary, providing some additional protection. Or in the case of a cactus flower, like you can see here, the ovary is actually embedded in the receptacle of the flower at the base and is protected in that way. All right, so the life cycle of flowering plants is very similar to that of the gymnosperms, but it differs in a couple of important respects. We only have time to talk about one of them today, but one of these ways in which the life cycle differs is that the gametophytes are highly reduced, even more so than in the gymnosperms. And this goes for both the male gametophyte, the pollen, and the female gametophyte inside the ovule. So the male gametophyte in a pollen at maturity only contains 3 cells, 2 sperm cells, both of which are necessary, and also a tube cell that mediates the growth of the pollen tube. And that's different than in gymnosperms, where we have a number of other cells in the pollen as well. So this is the bare minimum cellular content of a male gametophyte necessary for it to function. And we'll get into next time what's happened in the female gametophyte in this process of double fertilization. So see you on Friday.